I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice, tumbling down the rabbit hole? Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life. That there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of election, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. But I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people.
And now, welcome to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole. Here's your host from federaljack.com. It's Popeye.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another live edition. It is Tuesday, November 12th, 2013. I have a extremely interesting broadcast for you all tonight. I'm excited to bring back to the airwaves a guest I had on a few weeks ago. I was able to first introduce you, and we did a bit of a nutshell kind of overview on a broad variety of topics: UFOs, cryptids like Bigfoot, aliens, things like that. And he is such a wealth of information and an excellent researcher and a great author, I may add, that one show with him covering a few of these topics, for 20 minutes each, was not enough. So I'm going to devote as much time as I can to having him on, about specific topics and spend more time into each of these topics every few weeks, whenever he has the time to do so, because he does a lot of radio interviews, and he's, gracious enough to give up his 2 hours tonight to sit with us. So, author Nick Redfern. If you haven't heard the interview I did with him about 2 weeks ago, go listen to it. Great interview. Again, we kind of covered a lot of these topics that maybe aren't normally covered by many in the alternative media. It might be considered the fringe end of it, right? UFOs, stuff like that, Bigfoot, Loch Ness, other cryptids. But this stuff is interesting. Again, this is the stuff that brought me to conspiracy and everything else when I was a young lad. And I don't see any reason why we shouldn't look into things. And sometimes with constantly harping on how bad, Obamacare is, or how bad politics are, or the powers that shouldn't be, it's nice to have a bit of a distraction and look at some other weirdness, which is out there as well. Sometimes we get a little bit myopic with our views. Anyway, I don't want to waste any more time. I want to bring him up tonight. Tonight we're going to be discussing the real Men in Black. And no, it's nothing like the movie with Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith. And I know Nick's going to get into that, but let me bring him up to the airwaves for you all to hear. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the broadcast, author Nick Redfern. Nick, welcome back, brother.
Hey, Popeye. How's it going?
It's going real good.
Good.
This the topic of the Men in Black. I was talking with you about this off air a little bit. This is I admittedly did not know much about this topic, and you had told me a little bit about it. We had chatted off air. You had thrown a couple tidbits here and said, "Hey, you should check this out." And in preparation for tonight's broadcast, I was like, let me go look into some of these Men in Black stories. You know, I didn't want to just go listen to interviews that you've done and kind of reiterate the same things. I wanted to go actually look into some of the stories themselves, as well as, you know, I listened to a few of the interviews you've done, but I wanted to actually go dive into some of these stories. And, man, it's creepy. I mean, this isn't just... To me, I always thought the Men in Black were, you know, government agents. They came up with their, you know, fedoras and their suits on, and they came up, they busted your chops, scared you, put the fear of God into the whoever, and then left. And it's not that. This is actually a much, much deeper topic. So let's start off with the beginning. The Men in Black phenomenon, as it's called, it dates back to the 50s, correct? After World War II is when this phenomenon started, with the Men in Black and the suits with the fedoras?
Yeah, I mean, the whole sort of so-called modern era, the UFO subject, sort of took off in 1947 with a pilot named Kenneth Arnold, who had a sighting of like a fleet of UFOs over Mount Rainier in Washington State. But the weird thing is that although Arnold's sighting was 1947, the Men in Black phenomenon really didn't begin until about 1951, 1952. Although there were a few sporadic reports like that, it wasn't sort of developed into a phenomenon at that time. But what happened, it all began in a town called Bridgeport, Connecticut, involving a man named Albert Bender. And Albert Bender was someone who was, when the whole UFO subject kicked off in 1947, he was sort of in his mid to late 20s then, so turn of the early 50s, he was around about 30 thereabouts. And he had a deep interest in UFOs, but also the world of the paranormal in both fact and fiction. He was heavily into sort of the occult, life after death, ghosts, but also horror fiction, like H.P. Lovecraft and movies and things like that. And he set up a UFO group called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. And for whatever reason, we're not really sure why, but unlike a lot of other groups that were set up at the time, this one really caught the public's imagination. And in no time at all, Bender was selling like in excess of 1,000 copies of his monthly journal every month. And this wasn't just in the US, it was Australia, Britain, different parts of Europe, all over the place. And he really developed this huge network of followers. And then, quite literally out of the blue, and only about 5 or 6 months after the magazine had been going, he shut it down, and he also shut down the International Flying Saucer Bureau. And a lot of people thought, well, it was just like a gimmick, you know, to try and get publicity, and then he was going to come back. But he actually did, and he stayed out the subject for 10 years. And then again, and after that 10 years, he only came back very briefly to write his own book on what he said happened. But the short story is that he was visited by 3 men in black, who, like you said, scared the living daylights out of him and essentially made him leave ufology or suggested it would be a good idea to. But the problem was Bender was a bit of a reclusive and quiet character. Of all things, he lived in the attic of an old house that looked straight out of the house that Norman Bates would live in Psycho. And on top of that, he lived in the attic of this house. And he was going to actually change it into like a chamber of horrors type place and charge people to sort of wander around in this spooky old house. So, he did a lot of weird stuff. But because he was quite reclusive, he only sort of alluded to being silenced by the Men in Black. And a number of his colleagues and friends, one named Gray Barker, wrote a book about Bender's experiences in 1956 called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. And it tells the story of the visit from the Men in Black, but because Bender had been so reclusive and quiet on it, Barker assumed that Bender's experiences were with like the Men in Black that you've seen in the movies with Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith, sort of government people, not realizing that that's actually the exact opposite of what Bender was speaking about. And through no fault of Barker's, it was just because Bender wouldn't elaborate on it. So that kind of, Barker's book gave birth to the motif or the idea that the Men in Black are from the government. But it was only when Bender set the record straight later on and other reports began to surface that it became clear that it was sort of much stranger than that.
Yeah, and see, that's where my understanding of the Men in Black was. And it wasn't from the movie, the Tommy Lee Jones movie. I had heard about the Men in Black when I looked into UFOs. when I was much younger, because that's where I had been exposed to them, was the UFO thing. So I had always just, gotten with or I'd only been exposed to, rather, the story of them, government agents wearing the suits and the fedoras, and they always show up in these old cars, from the 50s, and that's all I knew. And I figured maybe it was a gimmick with it was some sort of gimmick, the way they dressed as a way to, kind of intimidate or whatever. And maybe, it still worked today because the suit would still be acceptable to walk around in. So it wouldn't you'd look a little out of place, but not too much so that you'd be like a spaceman walking around in a spacesuit in the middle of, lower Manhattan. It wouldn't be like that. So I always bought into that, but this Bender story in and of itself, the real story, not the version, the misconception of it, but the real story, it's much darker than that. It almost has occult leanings to it.
Oh, it does. I mean, when Barker, as I said, Barker left the UFO subject in 52, and people thought, well, he's going to be back in 3 or 4 months, and it'll be a good boost for his ratings and his magazine sales. But actually, it didn't happen. He walked away, and he just came back very briefly in 1962 because Gray Barker had been pestering him for years to write his own book on what really happened. And so Bender finally did that, and Barker was also a publisher as well as an author, so Barker published Bender's story. And Bender's book was called The Flying Saucers and the Three Men, and he told the story in Bender's own words of what really happened to him, which, as I said, was nothing to do with the government. And the basic story, if we go back to when Bender's magazine and his research was at its height from sort of 50 to 52, he used to, as I said, he's a very solitary character. Saturday nights, he just used to go to the cinema or whatever, and then go home. That was his sort of social life. And on a number of occasions, specifically after he'd started his UFO research, when he was walking home from the cinema through the sort of dark old streets of Bridgeport, he started to see these. The only way you can describe it is like shadowy, almost silhouetted figures, kind of in the shadows of the doorways and alleyways and things like that. And they seemed to have these weirdly glowing eyes. And he said even on a couple of occasions he kind of saw them sort of literally manifest in the dark corners of the cinema, but no one else could see them apart from him, and they seemed to be sort of staring intently at him with these weird-looking eyes. And then on several occasions when he was back at home, he would go to bed, or he'd go to his room, I should say, and on several occasions he'd start to feel dizzy and lightheaded and faint, and he'd be sort of overcome by this smell of like brimstone or sulfur, which is like a classic example of what happens in a lot of paranormal cases, sort of in olden times, the smell of brimstone was associated with the devil. And Bender said that he would be sort of sent nausea, into like a state of nausea by this kind of brimstone smell, and he would feel lightheaded and he would lay down. And then suddenly these three shadowy MIB-like figures would sort of literally sort of materialize through the wall and the doors and stand in front of him in kind of like a semi-spectral state, but they seemed to be like ghostly, but they're dressed in a black suit and an old-time black fedora. And they were described as very, very skinny, almost like emaciated skinny. Skin, the colour of somebody's face who's got severe anemia, just sort of, as white as milk. And they had this sort of menacing, starey look on the face where you could actually see through the glasses. You could see make a vague outline of the eyes, and they were kind of staring at him malevolently and warned him on a number of occasions to leave the UFO subject behind. And the Bender didn't, and the more he stayed with it, the sicker he got. He got sort of psychologically disturbed, but also physically ill. And again, that's something that happens in a lot of occult cases where people fall ill. They get diseases or illnesses and things like this. And so he kind of eventually got the message and dropped the subject and got married and left the whole subject behind. And this is sort of 53, 54, the very latest, when he dropped it all, and just went on to a new life. And the Men in Black after that never bothered him again, apparently. So their intimidation worked, and, as I said, he walked away from it and went back to sort of just a regular life. But it so kind of unbalanced him that, as I said, he stayed away for 10 years. And after he'd written the book, he just did, a couple of months promotion for it, and that was it again. 51 years later, he never surfaced again after that time. So it clearly intimidated him, and it clearly wasn't a gimmick, to sort of promote himself and make himself look intriguing and sell books. He was done with it,
And the Men in Black experience itself, the typical. It's hard to. From what I've seen, there's a few different types of Men in Black. So I guess you really can't say it's a typical Men in Black experience. But is there a common thread to these Men in Black experiences? Is there something that is common to all of them? Because I know, like I said, there are a few different types apparently of Men in Black, and I want to get into that too. But is there a common thread at all amongst them?
Well, there is. I mean, that actually is a good point. We can sort of get into that quite deeply because it is an important thing, the different categories of the MIB. But in terms of the weird MIB, there are several classic things that sort of bring them all together. One is that in many cases, the witnesses have never actually reported their encounter. So this is the big baffling thing, how the MIB actually know they've had some sort of weird experience. Now, you might imagine that, if you've seen a UFO, you had a paranormal experience, and the Men in Black come knocking on the door late at night, as they often do, sort of 10, 11, or even midnight, that, if they're ominous, they're going to threaten you, you might imagine that they're going to knock the door down or, force their way in, but they don't. They actually sort of stand patient. They knock on the door, and then if the person opens the door, they just stand there patiently waiting to be invited in, which is kind of very much like the old vampire legends of a vampire, can't enter your home until you're invited in on the first occasion. And they kind of look like vampires. They're dressed in black and they got white skin. It's like, how much closer could they get? So that's one of the interesting angles. They seem to have a lot of prior and very personal knowledge of the encounter, even, as I said, if the person hasn't reported it or even told anybody else. It's as if they were almost monitoring the event when it occurred. And very often, or usually, they never make sort of outright threats. They make kind of almost like oblique threats where you think, hey, was that guy just threatening me? That sort of thing where, it could go sort of two ways in terms of what they're trying to say, but the implication is it's a threat, So a lot of things like that. Very often they come in twos or threes and just one does the talking and the other one just kind of stares in a very intimidating, threatening fashion. One of the witnesses actually described the eyes of the Man in Black who just sat there staring at it, kind of like the eyes of a dog when it's about to bite you. If you loom over a dog and it gets scared, and its eyes go wide, it was kind of like that. So those are all sort of classic aspects. And one of the other ones is that, if the person isn't sure who they are, they offer them a drink or something like that. They usually refuse it. Or if they do accept it, they're almost puzzled by it as what they should actually do with it, which has sort of given rise to the idea, are they even sort of fully self-aware, or are they some sort of biological robot or some sort of, almost like a three-dimensional computer program that, they're just dispatched to do a job, and if you kind of throw it off, you sort of put a glitch in the program or whatever.
Have you ever seen a show on Fox called Fringe? It's
well, a lot of people don't know that, but the watchers in Fringe were actually based on the Men in Black reports. They actually use one famous example where a Man in Black was sitting in a restaurant and he couldn't eat the food properly. He didn't know how to eat Jell-O. He tried to drink it, and they had actually did something like that in one of the early episodes where they had one of the watchers in a restaurant and he couldn't figure out how to eat the food properly.
Yeah, they eat weird. They have they have mannerisms that are odd. That's why that made me think of that when I first saw that. I was like, oh wow, they remind me of the Observers.
Well, the Observers, I said, not watchers, but the Observers, they're actually taken directly from, that whole weird Men in Black imagery. They're the other side to Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones, if you like.
And it makes you wonder, because in the show they're a future human, they're like some future race, or future version of the human race, thousands of years ahead or whatever, and they figured out how to travel back in time, and or how to master time, whatever.
That is one of the theories for them, as to who they are. That is one of the ideas is, could they be time travelers?
I'm telling you, this subject, when I saw Fringe, I saw the guys, the observers, and I was like, yeah, they look like the MIBs, because the fedora and the suit and everything. And I was like, they look like government agents. And I was like, this is an interesting twist. But then when I started researching the real stories of, real MIB experiences, I was like, wow, they ripped off the content for the show from real stories. This is actually stranger than the show. And like we were talking off air, in some of the cases where people, I guess they have video footage, like there's security video footage from like a security cam of one of these supposed men in black, right, walking into a hotel in an area after a UFO sighting. And people in the hotel different people in the hotel reported interactions with this guy, and he seemed very, very odd, like you say, different mannerisms, very cold, like no feeling at all. I think the actors that played the observers in Fringe did a good job of conveying that cold, disconnected feeling that people seem to get when they experience the Men in Black. Have you seen the video footage in the hotel?
Yeah, I have. There's actually not that much footage and photographs of alleged Men in Black. I did write a book a couple of years ago called The Real Men in Black, and that actually does include 2 photos from the 60s of people who claim to have photographed Men in Black, and there's no doubt that they show, guys in black suits and fedoras and sunglasses. And one of the pictures is really creepy. It was taken actually by a friend of mine named Tim Beckley, who was just like in his early 20s back then, but I think Tim's probably in his late 60s now or something like that, I think. But he kind of let me use a picture in the book, and it shows this guy just sort of staring, almost zombified, out of this doorway in New York in 1965, I think it was. And he's just kind of standing there staring. He's got the fedora, the sunglasses, and he's totally out of the place, sort of just recessed in this doorway. And he was actually photographed standing outside the home of a couple of UFO researchers, Jack and Mary Robinson, who'd been sort of intimidated, and they got all sort of weird phone calls and phone interference, and then it sort of culminated with this MIB, who was there 5 or 6 days in a row, and that's what allowed Tim to photograph him. That Mary phoned him up in sort of hysterics, if you like, said, coming over, this guy's been here several days, get a picture of him, see if we can figure out who he is. So Tim raced over, got the picture, and it's there today, and he does look weird. He kind of just looks menacingly strange and totally out of place, just staring outwards. So there's a few things like that, but not many pictures. They're kind of almost too elusive when it comes to wanting to be photographed.
Which is, if they were government agents, okay, I could see how there might not be too many photos of them, but even when these guys think they're undercover, at protests or whatever, you can see protesters are taking pictures and then, drawing around their face in Photoshop and with an arrow and, undercover cop. So there's, they would get spotted eventually if they were normal humans.
Yeah.
Let's say. So maybe
there's a lot of people.
No, go on.
Well, just a lot of people sometimes wonder if the Men in Black experiences occur in kind of like an altered state of mind, almost like a Matrix situation where it's like they create like a living hologram type thing to menace the people. In other words, which makes it impossible to photograph most of them because some people suggested the occurrence actually takes place in almost like a dream-like holographic state, as if the Men in Black program, if you want to call it a program, is sort of hot-wired into our brains, and we think it's occurring in the 3D world, but it's sort of like the message and the threat is done in our mind, but we, as I said, we visualize it kind of like in the Matrix movies where we think we're seeing the real world be around us, but it's sort of, our minds have been temporarily taken over, and it was never in that case like a 3D encounter, sitting and get opposite each other on the couch or whatever.
Kind of like Agent Smith in the Matrix.
Kind of like, yeah, exactly like that, where, they insert a threat into the program, and the the program is then sent out to perform a particular task. And if it occurs in an altered state, then that might explain the lack of much in terms of the way of photographs and footage if it doesn't occur in our reality as we normally understand it.
True. And another interesting aspect is you talked about how they have a similarity to the vampire stories of the older times where they have to be asked in. Well, vampires also didn't show up in mirrors, and if I remember correctly, there was even and there's probably debate in the vampire community amongst this, but sometimes they don't show up in photos either. So maybe that has there's a correlation between the two there. It's interesting
another link. Go on.
No, go on.
I was just going to say, there's actually another vampire parallel as well. And that comes from the fact that, if you look at the old vampire legends, well, vampires suck blood to live or drink blood. And you can find vampire legends all around the world. It doesn't begin with Bram Stoker and Dracula. There are stories of vampire-type creatures go way back to ancient Babylonian times, which are thousands of years. But they have different names, and they didn't all sort of wear black suits and black cloaks or whatever, or kind of look like, true blood.
Nick, I'm going to pause us. I'm going to pause us right there because the break is sneaking up on us. So Hold that thought. Ladies and gentlemen, don't go anywhere. We'll be back in less than 3 minutes. Interesting stuff. Stay tuned. I'm telling you, truth is actually stranger than fiction sometimes. We are back, ladies and gentlemen. Hanging out tonight with author Nick Redfern. He's authored 2 books, ladies and gentlemen. 2 so far. He's working on a 3rd on this subject alone. Not to mention all the other books he's written, but on the subject of the Men in Black by itself. One of the reasons I respect his work is because as a researcher, he doesn't put himself in a box. He doesn't pigeonhole himself. He doesn't say, I'm only going to look at the creepy government aspect, agents working with aliens, pigeonholing myself. No. I'm going to look at the broad variety of different stories and different things. And I also have my own nickname for him. I like to call Nick, I told him this earlier, I like to call him the king of crossovers. And that's because as a researcher, looking into this stuff, as an independent, I don't, label myself as, a ufologist or this or that. I look into it all. I respect his work because he looks into this stuff and he's not afraid to see that it might cross over into something here in the occult, might cross over into something in the paranormal, might cross over into something with, there's Men in Black sightings with Bigfoot. It just goes, we're going to get into it all, but the point is, he's not afraid to look into this. As researchers, I often say, when I try to sit and talk to you all, I say, I want you to be autodidacts. I want you to teach yourselves. That's my goal with this, is to inspire you all to teach yourselves, become self-taught individuals. But I also don't want you to only look at one thing. I want you to be so open-minded that you're willing to look at a broad variety of things and then follow where your interests take you. But whatever research you do, don't allow yourself to get emotionally attached to one specific tiny little theory, and then when new information comes down the pike, you actually end up attacking that information, and you're more of now a gatekeeper than you are a researcher. And Nick doesn't do that, and that's one of the reasons I really respect his work. He's a researcher, first and foremost, an investigative journalist and an author, and he's not afraid to speak his mind about, like I said, he's the king of crossovers. I'm sure he probably gets a lot of crap for it. In fact, Nick, I noticed that there is a bit of in the research community, there are this separation where, you know, the ufologist and the Bigfoot people, and maybe the specifically the Men in Black people or whatever, they might argue. And I can only imagine that the Men in Black issue itself is pretty contentious, because you have all these different versions of, you know, stories. They all, like you said, there is a common theme, but they all. Oh, and this goes back thousands of years, like with the vampire stories, and if you think about it with alchemists and the beings that would come to them, you know, this is not a new phenomenon. This is something that's been going on for a very long time, and it does have this broad range of crossover. And I wanted to take a minute or two to, you know, applaud you for having the courage to stand up and admit that, yes, there are all these different connections amongst all these different weird things going on, and that you can't just pigeonhole it and put it into a little easily filed cabinet. You know what I mean? You can't just, yes, we're going to file it away neatly here in this little file folder. It's not that simple. You know, the rabbit hole is actually much deeper. And as a researcher myself, I just wanted to give you a big thumbs up for that, and I wanted to plug your 2 books on the Men in Black. In fact, plug your website and the best place for people to buy not only your Men in Black books, but any of the other books that you've written, which if you buy them all, you're going to need a U-Haul, ladies and gentlemen. He's that kind of author.
Well, people can reach me at Nick Redfern 14, Fortean, 14.blogspot.com, or just type Nick Redfern into Facebook and you'll find me there. People can get the books from Amazon or off the shelves in Barnes & Noble. And the 2 books I've done on the Men in Black mystery, the first one was called On the Trail of the Saucer Spies, and excuse me, and the second one was called The Real Men in Black. And the first one came out in 2006, and the second one in 2011. But yeah, you're right. I mean, there are crossovers, and I've never sort of really understood this issue of UFO researchers won't get involved in UFO, or don't like to get involved in UFO cases where somebody may have seen a Bigfoot, and in vice versa, cryptozoologists don't like to focus on Bigfoot cases where somebody saw strange lights over the woods at the same time. And I've never really got that, because to me it's like their minds are already made up and they're driven by a belief system as to what Bigfoot is or what UFOs are, and anything that goes a bit weird or outside of the box, they don't want to deal with it because it don't fit neatly into their belief systems. And I've never got that. You know, my view has always been, well, let's look at all the evidence, because if we don't look at it all, we're going to end up biased and only seeing half the picture, and that's kind of destroys the point of doing research. You want to go where the evidence leads, not where you want it to lead. And you know, that's what I try and do, is just go with where the evidence pushes me. That's all you can really do. And you know, like we were talking about before the break with these vampire parallels, I mean, a lot of UFO researchers won't touch that, but I mean, this other big parallel I was going to mention to you is the fact that, you know, in the old legends and myths, vampires drink blood. Well, in a lot of the Men in Black accounts, obviously, you know, the witnesses aren't being drained of blood, but many of them do say that when the MIB are sat opposite them, they feel drained of energy, as if the MIBs are almost like psychic vampires. And one of the witnesses actually described it as, I mean, I'm not diabetic, so I can't say what it's exactly like, but I mean, one of the witnesses said it was kind of like if you're diabetic and if you've missed 2 meals by mistake or whatever, or you're trapped without food somewhere, you start to crash. And so that's how they felt, was like, you know, they were just plummeting into like a sugar emergency or whatever. And they literally did, and we get a lot of reports like that where people feel they're being drained of like almost like psychic energy, or, you know, some mysterious energy in the body, who knows what. And the MIB are almost like thriving and living on it, as, you know, as if possibly they are like a psychic vampire, that perhaps possibly even the reason for their visit is to sort of frighten the witness into creating like a high state of energy, and then they feed on that high state of energy, you know, as if it's their way of sort of using us in almost like a parasite fashion.
And again, that would fit in with the not only the vampire stories, but even some of these stories of where people would say they saw I wonder if when people thought they saw demons, because again there is an occult aspect to this, I wonder if sometimes that dark cloaked figure could be, attributed to some of these same shadowy figures that were seen in the past too. Like I brought up alchemists. They used to see these. They would see these figures, otherworldly beings, whatever you want to call them, cloaked figures, and they would, kind of set them on the right path or warn them not to do stuff. And you see this throughout history too.
Yeah, you get a lot of stories like that. Alchemy, particularly, that the parallels with the UFO subject and alchemy. There aren't really parallels in terms of the phenomena, but where we do have the parallel is that UFO witnesses get silenced and threatened by the Men in Black, and alchemists who also looking into like a fringe science will get these sort of late night visits from these mysterious black cloaked individuals or whatever, trying to put them on the right path or warn them away from the wrong path. And when you also mention things like demons, well, there are a number of cases where people were heavily into things like demonology and they got MIB visits. I mean, classic example is Albert Bender, who was deeply into things like demonic issues and Ouija boards. And, the idea is maybe part of the UFO phenomenon is somehow interlinked with this, and Bender opened kind of a doorway that led these things through. And again, that's something to be aware of, in the paranormal world, that people think it's kind of cool to sort of, let's get the Ouija board out and, and is anybody there, that kind of thing, or have a seance. But, the sort of classic image of a bunch of teenagers doing it on a Friday night, with a bunch of beer or whatever, often people don't realize the seriousness of the fact that there are other realms. And I do believe that if you know how to do it, you can bring things through, and what you bring through may not always be a positive thing, and maybe that's what some of these MIB are, and that might explain why they've actually visited people and threatened people who've been involved in the world of the occult, never mind UFOs.
And researching this, I was thinking about how would I react if I was approached like this. I mean, I already had the Fed show up at my door literally a couple years ago for my activism when I went to a local city council meeting and started talking about fluoride in the water. And I mentioned 9/11. The mayor actually called because I didn't live in the same town. We lived next door, but I had to go to their city council. Long story short, he couldn't get me with his goons, so he called the FBI on me. So I have had the Fed show up before, but I thought to myself, how would I react if these creepy, black fedora-wearing, suit-wearing MIBs showed up at my door? And if it was, these MIBs, knowing what I know, you would think, well, I would tell them to go screw or beat it or whatnot. And there are cases where people have said that, but what I also find interesting is that there are people that after they've actually invited these people in, and they've sat down and talked to them, and then they leave. As they're walking out the door, or as they close the door, this person has the epiphany of, why did I just let these people in my house? I never would have let them in to begin with. And it's kind of weird, like mind control, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what it's like. I mean, that's the big issue about the Men in Black reports, and why I don't think it's anything to do with the government as such, is because, if the doorbell rings at, say, 11 o'clock at night, or there's this loud hammering on the door, or slow hammering, you can think, who the hell's that? There's possibly one or two possibilities. Either somebody's casing the place to try and break in and see if there's anybody home, or it's the police with bad news. So you probably are going to go through the door, at least look through the spy hole. But if you see through the spy hole, three guys in black suits who are like 5 foot tall and 130 pounds and pale as milk and wearing fedora hats at midnight, who's going to open the door to them? You're going to probably just dial 911. But people do. They open the door and they stand there while the MIB say, why they're here. And then they invite them in. They invite them to sit down, and then the MIB reel off all these questions that they want to know about the experience, and the person gives all the answers, and then the MIB kind of suddenly stand up, and they don't even say goodbye or anything, they just leave, sort of go out the door almost in like single file fashion. And then, as you say, when the MIB have gone, say a minute or two afterwards, which gives them the chance to get away, it's almost like the person's mind begins to clear and their logical part of their brain kicks in again. Number one, why on earth did I open the door in the first place at midnight? Number two, why did I let him in when there were three of them, and easily could be overpowered or whatever? Why did I answer all their questions? Why didn't I think to follow them when they left? You have all these different aspects, and it literally is almost as if these MIB can take control of the person's mind from the get-go, and they're totally in control of the situation. And I don't, it's not that clearly not down to sort of putting some fast-acting drug in a drink or anything like that, because they've got control from the minute the front door opens. So there's obviously some sort of a psychic component there, in my view at least, that allows them to have that type of control. And again, that's one of the main reasons why I think we're dealing with something far weirder than any sort of official agency, or even an unofficial agency. I think it's just something totally removed from all that.
And when you were talking about how they kind of, the mannerisms and the weirdness, when we were discussing that before, this clicks into the other side of it, is if someone does stick up for themselves. I've noticed that in the stories when people do stand up for themselves, these MIBs, whatever they are, whoever they are, they don't know how to react. It's almost like they're not used to that reaction, like they can't compute somebody saying no to them.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, a lot of people probably would assume that if you stand up to the Men in Black, be kind of like in the movies, they get tough with you or they threaten you and all this. They don't. There's none of that at all. The MIB response is sort of confusion and almost like panic. And this is why some people believe they are kind of, you can look at it in two ways. If the events occur in like almost like a matrix-like state, well, it's kind of like the MIB at the program, and the programmer has sent the program into the mainframe or whatever, or started the program, and then by questioning them or telling them to leave or standing up against them, that's almost like you're the virus and you've screwed with the program, and the program has got a glitch in it and starts to go off course. And very often, the Men in Black, as I said, don't threaten people. They just hastily make a retreat and leave. And they kind of get confused. They stumble. Their words don't come out right. And it's almost like an emergency situation for them. So there is something to the idea that, like I said, maybe they're not even fully self-aware of what they even are. If they are some sort of almost like a program, but even like a physical program in some sense, perhaps, that's sent out, they may not literally have a full understanding of what they are, other than the basics of the operation that they're designed to carry out. So again, that sort of creates another very odd aspect to it.
In your research, how many different types of Men in Black have you come across?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, certainly we've got this paranormal occult type, the skinny guys with the white faces that make up most of the reports. Now, of course, we do know that in some cases that government personnel did legitimately visit UFO witnesses in the late 40s and 50s, not from a sinister perspective, but because they were trying to get a handle on what on earth people were seeing in the skies. So, they did do sort of, house inquiries. Now, of course, back then, the guys did wear black suits and fedoras. That was the style, but and so in other words, I think some early MIB reports have become known as MIB reports, but they were actually innocent visitations where, somebody had seen a UFO, perhaps the military or an official agency was trying to understand what was going on, so they knocked on the door and said, hey, can we speak to you about your experience? And over time, that's sort of been mutated by mythology into a Men in Black encounter. So that's two examples. But I mean, there are other theories as well. You have the time travel theory. Maybe, for example, the reason why they look out of time, they wear sort of 50 suits and fedora hats and drive old cars, it's an interesting theory, the idea that maybe if they're from the far future, maybe that history as their history, which is our present, has somehow been lost, and maybe there's been some big disaster and they've only got fragmentary information on our present. And that includes fragmentary information on styles and fashions, and so they kind of think they're blending in when they're not fully aware of, the changes in fashion, so they look out of place. Then, you have the fact that in some reports they have this vampire angle. Other ones they see, there are cases where there's no UFO angle at all, and the person just got the visit for dabbling into occult issues. You also have the so-called tulpa theory, which is like a thought form, the idea of the mind, somebody being able to literally create these things in the mind and then externalizing the imagery into something that, again, is semi-self-aware and kind of exists in a weird fashion for a short time before fragmented into nothing. So you have a lot of different angles, and ironically, and what makes it more confusing is that I don't think the MIB mystery is explainable via one theory. I really do think there's possibly two, maybe even three different things going on.
It definitely is a lot broader of a subject than I actually realized. I looked into it. I was like, okay, government people maybe, working with, aliens or something, like some people, ufologists have talked about or whatnot. But no, this is, it's really a strange topic. I mean, like I said, the only thing I've seen recently, entertainment-wise, that does it somewhat justice is the creepiness of the observer character on the show Fringe, which is interesting because he shows up to these. They show up, at least in that show, to these fringe scientists, and these fringe scientists seeing these men in black figures is not a creation of the writers of the show, but actually this is another one of these type of men in black encounters where it's not just people, like you said, researching UFOs. In a lot of instances, it's people doing research into fringe science for real, in real life, in reality, or whatever you want to call this, reality, this matrix that we live in, right? And these people as well have experiences where they actually run into these men in black, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the thing about the Men in Black mystery, even though really the modern era, it started in, let's say, the late 40s, early 50s, the fact that we can find parallels, sort of the vampire parallels, and before that the alchemists getting visits and all this kind of stuff, to me suggests it's actually a very old mystery. And the sort of the modern-day motif of the fedora and the black hat, the black suit, is just really a way to allow them to move amongst us today. 500 years ago, it was guys in black cloaks warning the alchemists. Before that, it was mysterious visitors who would sort of, turn up on people's doorsteps and things like this. And so I think, although the Men in Black are sort of most noticeably linked to the UFO subject, I think they're actually almost like paranormal police, if you like, of the entire paranormal world. I'll give you a really intriguing example. One particular case where somebody had a UFO encounter, and not particularly overly significant, and that is sometimes how it works as well, where it's not always a really amazing case. Sometimes it's just, a random light in the sky. But in one case, the witness saw a UFO, and then the second night got a visit from the Men in Black, and only hours after the MIB left, they started to experience a violent outbreak of poltergeist activity in the home, which, under normal circumstances, there should be no connection really between a nuts and bolts UFO and poltergeist activity, and yet somehow or other there was. So I think we're clearly not seeing the full picture. We've maybe only seen the barest minimum of the picture. And, when we talk about the government angle, people often think, well, the government knows. I actually don't think they do. I think they know there's a real Men in Black phenomenon, but I really would be very surprised if they have more of a handle on it than we do in terms of having actual proof. I think they know there's something going on, or certain people in government do, and I think they know it's a sinister phenomenon, and more importantly, they know it's not them. So that's what concerns them, I think. But as far as actually being on the track of who or what they are, I think they're probably kind of sitting around. Who's ever's watching this in government, I'm sure people are watching it. They're probably having the same kind of conversations as we are, saying, well, what are they? Who are they? What about this theory? I think it's something along that line that they really don't know any more than we do.
And to back that point up, you did a Freedom of Information Act request and ended up getting paperwork from the FBI that showed that Hoover was looking into this, correct?
Well, yeah, these are actually documents that have surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act, and they talk about how in the 1950s the FBI got involved in this because somebody actually contacted the FBI. They read a copy of Gray Barker's book, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, which was published in 1956. And as I said, it told Albert Bender's story. So the person who read the book contacted the FBI and said, I've read about these reports of these men in black suits silencing UFO witnesses. Who are they? And you actually have internal FBI documents where the FBI are asking questions, to the effect of, well, who are the men in black? And on top of that, there's actually quite a well-known now U.S. Air Force document from the 60s, which was circulated to every U.S. Air Force base in the mainland United States. And it was a memo talking about how people had been visited by guys in black suits claiming to, represent government agencies or whatever, and had taken evidence from people's homes and threatened them. And they're clearly talking about the men in black. But the Air Force, by default is saying, well, who the hell are the men in black? So, we've got evidence that behind the scenes, yes, the men in black mystery is being addressed, but there's no smoking gun as to who they are. The military and the government really is as puzzled as we are as to who these guys are. Which
makes one wonder, okay, if it's not government, and perhaps the government could use it and mimic the, I'm sure the government has mimicked the phenomenon itself to scare people and get messages across on its own in certain cases. But I'm one of the, originally, like I said to you, when Men in Black, I thought it was, government guys, right? Not so much the kooky Tommy Lee Jones or Will Smith character, but something along the lines of it was government-based, whatever. Now it's almost like it's some sort of otherworldly type thing, or maybe other interdimensional type thing, and our government has just mimicked it at certain times, like they would with UFOs, with new technology, pretend they're aliens instead of admitting it's some new weapon of war, right? So, I mean, they have done it in the past, so who's to say they wouldn't do it again? I'm going to pause us right there, Nick, because the break is coming up. Ladies and gentlemen, do not go anywhere. Stay tuned. Hour 1 up, but hour number 2 coming up. Don't go anywhere. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back with hour number 2 here on tonight's live edition of Down the Rabbit Hole. I am your host, Popeye, from federaljack.com. It is Tuesday, November 12th, 2013. Tonight, I am talking with author Nick Redfern. Again, I had him on a few weeks ago. You should go listen to the first broadcast I did with him, but it was a nutshell overview of a slew of different topics. But because this stuff is so in-depth, and he is such an in-depth researcher, we shall say, you have to go get his books to understand what I'm talking about. But there's so much information out there, and he's acquired so much information and put it together in so many books that I have to have him on frequently, because he's just, as I said, he's like a human warehouse of information on the strange and interesting things going on around us that we don't pay too much attention to. Again, we as humans have this arrogance about us that we think we know everything, and honestly, I think we know only about 5% of what's actually going on around us and what's actually going on out there. So, getting back into the Men in Black tonight, I want to ask Nick a few different questions about worldwide experiences. If there's a broad variety of them throughout the world, like there seems to be in different states of the U.S., and if they have the same pattern of it's not just UFOs and everything else. But first, I want to give him as much time as he needs, 30 seconds, minute, whatever. I want you to go ahead, Nick, and shamelessly plug your website and everything else again, and plug the best spot for people to buy the books. Because I know sometimes people prefer that the readers go to Amazon. Sometimes they prefer they go to their own website and buy it directly from the website. So wherever is best, that best benefits you as the author, where should people go to get all your books?
Sure. Well, people can get them, and particularly The Real Men in Black, they can get from Amazon, or you can walk into Barnes & Noble. Barnes & Noble keep it in stock on the shelves. And my blog is Nick Redfern 14, FORTEAN .blogspot.com, and I cover everything from UFOs, Bigfoot, paranormal. I don't sort of get involved in like regular political issues and conspiracies. It's sort of anything with a paranormal slant to it. Or people can find me on Facebook. Just type in Nick Redfern. There are a few Nick Redferns on Facebook, but scroll down and you'll come to me eventually. And people want to contact me, always pleased to chat, or people have got stories they want to share or questions they want to ask. Again, I'm always happy to do that.
And speaking of questions, what I'm going to do is, if anybody wants to ask a question, go over to, there's two spots you can get to the chat room. It goes to the same spot. You can go over to federaljack.com, which is my website. You all know that. Go to the Listen Live page for Down the Rabbit Hole. There's a chat room right there. And you can throw the question in there, or go over to truthfrequencyradio.com, and up at the top there's in the header, there's a thing that says chat room there. Click on that, and it'll bring you to the same chat page, but on Truth Frequency's website. And either way, it's just two different portals into the same room. It's like two different entrances. Anyway, go to there and throw your questions in there, and I'll pick one or two questions from there to ask Nick later on. But right now, I want to pick his brain because we only have an hour left. And like he said, there's so much information about this that he actually had to write multiple books on the subject. So even 2 hours is not enough time to get into this subject as deep as it deserves to be looked into. So you need to go buy his books. And that's not me plugging his books because he came on. It's, again, you've all been listening to me for long enough period of time now that you understand that if I plug an author, it's because I actually respect his work. I don't bring authors on just because they're authors. I only bring them on if I've read their work and I think that it's respectable and I respect the way they do their work or the message that they're trying to convey. So go get his books. I promise you, you won't be sorry in the least. And not everything, yes, I do often talk about conspiracy and politics and government stuff like that, and the Kennedy assassination is one of my specialties, but this stuff is also out there, and I also happen to be interested in this, and I've looked into the paranormal, the weird, the cryptids, all this stuff my whole life. So again, that's what led me to conspiracy. I promise you, you guys will not be sorry with his work. So Nick, I have to ask you this because I had my wife is interested in a lot of this stuff, and she grew up in Puerto Rico. She wanted me to ask, have you come across in your research any Men in Black sightings on the island of Puerto Rico itself? And if so, were they only in connection to UFOs, or is it like this, like the rest of these other stories where it's kind of a broader variety of what it's connected to?
Well, yeah, the first part of the question is, yes, I have actually come across just one case from Puerto Rico, and it was like a classic MIB encounter, but it actually had nothing to do with UFOs. Rather, it was all to do with the Chupacabra mystery. I've been to Puerto Rico on many occasions now looking for the Chupacabra, first time in 2004, and the most recent time actually in August of this year. And every time I've been there, I've got a lot of different stories from everybody from ranchers to veterinarians to police officers to civil defense people who have had some sort of input or other on the particular subject of the Chupacabra and what it might be. Is it some sort of paranormal creature? Is it an alien? Is it a myth? Is it some sort of weird genetic experiment? Is it an occult thing? Nobody really knows, but a lot of people have got different theories, particularly those who've seen the creature or come across farm animals reportedly attacked by it. Well, when this particular MIB case that I investigated was in 2005, and I travelled out there with a Canadian TV company called Red Star Films, and it was to make a television documentary for Canada's Space Channel on the whole cattle mutilation and animal mutilation mystery. And because the Chupacabra attacks reportedly involved sort of mutilations of animals, this was part of the story. And while we were out there, we had a guy who knew a lot of different people to speak to on the island, named Orlando Pla. And Orlando put us in touch with a farmer who'd had a very strange, not just a man in black experience, but a woman in black experience as well. And that's also the subject of another book I'm working on, is women in black accounts. But this particular encounter had occurred a few months before we went out to Puerto Rico, and the director and owner of the film company, Paul Kimball, thought, it'd be a great idea to interview this guy because his story had so many different strands to it. So we went out, and Paul was sort of directing, and the cameraman, a guy named John Rossborough, John was filming me and the witness as I spoke to him and asked all the various questions, and Orlando was the translator because he could only speak Spanish. And basically the story was that over the course of a couple of nights, the rancher had attacks, sort of quite violent attacks on his animals where they've been slashed and not killed, fortunately, but slashed quite badly and traumatized. And so one night he decided to stay up in the event that whatever was doing the attacks came back. And sure enough, on, say, the second or third night, something like that, I think it was, the animals started going crazy in the pens, and one of his pigs was about to be attacked when he basically jumped up and whatever the creature was saw him and bounded out of the pen. And he described it as kind of like a bipedal, almost like a monkey-type creature, but bigger, but hairless, and having like a row of spikes down its head and vicious claws, and which is how the Chupacabra is kind of described. And he threw his machete at this animal. He got a machete rather than a gun, and he said it kind of bounced off and made like a noise, almost like an armor plating, like metal on metal. And he bounded off into the darkness. Bear in mind, he lived in a little village in the wilds of Puerto Rico, not too far from the El Yunque rainforest. So in a very, very jungle-fired rainforest type environment, no artificial illumination or street lights. So, when the creature had gone 20 feet or so, it was just total blackness. But the very next morning, where he got really weird, he said that he got a visit from a pair of characters in black suits. One was a classic man in black. He got like the black suit on and the black fedora, and the other one was a woman dressed in black, and she was dressed in kind of like a black business suit, like a woman's business suit. And they were both very cold and emotionless, very, very white-skinned, came straight to the point and asked questions about, the experience, what did he think the creature was, and asked him to explain all the ins and outs of the experience. But what was weird was that they popped up in front of his doorstep. He opened the door, and there they were in these black suits. Bear in mind, this was the height of summer in Puerto Rico, and the temperature was just burning up. And they were just stood there, seemingly not even bothered by the heat or the fact that they were wearing suits and the guy's tie was done up to his Adam's apple, not sweating or anything. And the interview actually went on the doorstep. That was the weird thing as well. And when they were satisfied that he'd related all the facts, they just turned around, didn't even say goodbye, and walked off, and literally walked off into the woods. Not even there wasn't a main road, as I said, it was just a little village in the middle of nowhere, but they walked off into the woods, never to be seen again. And so that was sort of like a typical MIB thing, but, on the island of Puerto Rico. And it was clear to me when I interviewed the guy, he didn't have any knowledge of the Men in Black mystery or UFOs, I don't think. He'd had this experience, and he actually contacted the local civil defense people because of his animals being attacked. And, he wanted somebody to come out, and that's how Orlando got hold of the story. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had it. But it's sort of very, very weird one. But it had all those classic overtones to it that go sort of right back to the 50s or whatever.
And are there others worldwide? Like, I know there's, aside from Puerto Rico and the U.S., are there any of these sightings in the Europe or in Europe or the EU or Russia, China, Japan, any of these other countries?
Well, yeah, I mean, Britain certainly gets a lot of reports. The interesting thing is that whereas in the American reports, even today, the Men in Black drive these old-style 1950s Cadillacs and, cars that kind of look like they should have been in some 1940s gangster movie. They still drive those today. Well, it's kind of similar in England, where they're very often described as driving sort of 1950s and 1960s era English black cars. And they're not driving American style, but they're driving English ones. But they're very similar. They knock on the door, they're intimidating, they have this weird vibe to them that people find unsettling. Kind of that thing where we've all done this, where you've met somebody you've never met before, but you get this kind of unsettling vibe and atmosphere from them, but you don't know why. And that's something that's typically reported in the British reports, that the people feel uneasy around these Men in Black, but they're not sure exactly what the reason for that is. So we definitely get a lot of reports in Britain, and they go back to broadly the same time period, the 50s, right up to the present day. And a lot of reports from Mexico, interestingly enough. I've got more than a few of those on file, and also South America. I don't personally have any reports from China and Japan or Russia. I've got quite a few Australian reports. Now, that doesn't mean they're not going on in these other countries. It may just be, to what extent we hear about them or don't, be purely through, whether people tell their stories or not. That's the other big issue. We only know about cases if people come forward. But certainly parts of Europe, definitely Australia, Canada, England, South America, a lot of reports from there. Logic would dictate that they're everywhere. But again, it just comes down to if we're told about it or not,
It just goes to show you that this is not, a small, limited phenomenon in one limited area, that this is kind of, a much larger thing. And so it just makes you wonder, right?
Yeah, I mentioned I'm working on a new book on the Men in Black now, and again, this strictly follows the paranormal path. But the reason why it strictly follows that is because all the cases I've got go down that path. There isn't a single one that has anything to do with government stuff. And the new book I'm working on is kind of a bit different, where I'm sort of introducing, with like a bio, the background on the person, and then after the case, I'm including like a comment section from me where I try and sum it up. But the entire story will just be the witness's very own words. All the interviews have been tape recorded, so that I can transcribe it literally and without any changes. And so, sort of 85, 90% of the book will be nothing but the witness's own words. It's about 40 or 50 people. And then, as I said, with me, with a little intro and then a comment section after trying to figure it out. And the reason why I'm sort of doing it this way is because I get so many reports. I probably get 20 or 30 reports a year. And of those, maybe 20 or 30% of the people don't want their stories telling. And if they don't, that's fine. I don't publish them, and I don't tell anybody about them. They just stay with me. But a good 60, 70% of people quite happy to have their stories told. And that's why, I am able to do this third book, because the witnesses, not only have they been good enough to allow me to use the stories, but the fact that there are so many. And even today, I think the most recent case I'll be using in the book is from, I think it was October or November of last year. It's actually on the island of Cyprus. And the guy who saw this particular Man in Black described it just like the sort of thing Albert Bender saw. This skinny guy in a black suit and hat, and almost like as if his face was painted like a white waxy substance or whatever. And nothing's changed, sort of 60 years later, that they're still going on exactly as they were before.
And it makes you wonder, are they Are they time travelers? Are they interdimensional beings? Like you brought up earlier, are they projections in a like an altered state? Because that's an interesting concept. Because as you said, there's a lot of these sightings where people are in an altered state, where they're taking DMT or something like that, or LSD, and people could probably try to chalk it up to, oh well, it's the drug. But is it really the drug, or is it the drug opening a gateway in your mind to allow you to see something that maybe you wouldn't normally be able to see because that switch has been turned off?
No, I actually think it is the latter. I don't think, you can look at like shamanic experiences from hundreds and thousands of years ago where, the shaman of the little village would ingest a psychedelic root or whatever, would sort of converse with these magical entities. I don't think it was the brain misfiring or just going on a wild trip. I think there is something to the idea that psychedelics open portals to other realms. I really do believe that. And you can look throughout history, as I said, when medicine men and the shamans, and the witch doctor, it's sort of all different terms for people who experience things in an altered state of mind. And I think that kind of ties in with all this as well. But I kind of find the whole time travel angle kind of intriguing. A lot of it, of course, is dependent on whether or not time travel is actually feasible, which, of course, are a lot of questions. Not many people say, yes, it is, versus people say, well, no, it's nonsense. But if you look at the facts, everything about the Men in Black is out of time. The cars, the clothes, as I said earlier. They don't understand our mannerisms, our ways, but they're close enough to us to where, they can mix amongst us. And I guess it's kind of like, if we went back just 200 years, how difficult would it be to blend in? Okay, let's say you're an agent from today and you find, there's a secret project that's running a time travel project, and you went back to, say, 1785 in, let's say, New York or Boston, one of the big cities that was built back then. And you try to blend in. If you've got the right clothing, well, what would you do if you went into a store to buy food or a pint of beer in a pub? You would still stand out. I don't care what anybody says. You would still stand out, through your words, your mannerisms. You wouldn't really know what to ask for or how to order things. Do you know what I mean? It would be very difficult to do it in a way where you weren't noticed for at least one strange thing. And so the time travel theory is an interesting one, because there are actually also cases where the Men in Black have asked the witnesses, what time is it? And the witnesses said, well, 4:30. But maybe they're literally asking, what time is it? Not what hour is it, but what time are we in? And the fact that the Men in Black do often come across like awkward and confused, well, if you're constantly sort of surfing timelines back and forth, it probably would fry with your brain. Your reality moorings are kind of totally shattered. You're sort of going back and forth and possibly even manipulating timelines. That's one of the theories that's been put forward, is that the biggest irony, or most ironic theory, is what if the Men in Black aren't the bad guys? What if they're kind of like time cops who come back to try and fix glitches in the time frame so that past, present, and future don't get distorted, and then some big disaster happens where something's wiped out of history or wiped out of the future. So in other words, the idea that maybe they're not the bad guys, that they're actually, when they threaten us, it's unknowingly to us, it's for our own good, because they're trying to fix a glitch that, threatens to suddenly make somebody never have existed or whatever,
Well, that's why when I saw the show Fringe and I saw the Observer character, I was like, wow, interesting angle, because, if you understand quantum mechanics and you understand, people research quantum physics, they start to, even the slightest bit of research into it, I've actually talked about it on air before, you'd understand that perhaps time travel is possible. And if time isn't what we think it is, and it's different, and it is possible to travel through it, perhaps these individuals are, like you said, time cops. Who knows? And to not to not at least discuss it, because there's obviously something going on. So to stick your head in the sand and not want to talk about it at all, or put your fingers in your ears and go, la 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 la, that's not going to solve anything. Yeah, we can at least ponder and try to figure out what's going on. I mean, there's obviously something here. I'm more of the interdimensional or time travel person myself. So those are the two aspects I look at. And I kind of look at interdimensional travel and time travel almost like they hinge with one another, because they would both depend on quantum physics, and an understanding of how things really work like that on that level, in order for either one of those two things to work, which is interesting, because that stuff, modern day science, when you look at quantum physics, quantum mechanics, it says that. It tells you that, there's a lot of weirdness that you don't know. It actually, it forces you to accept that we don't know everything that we think. Like I said before, we, as humans, we tend to be, I think, a bit arrogant, Nick, because we think we know everything there is to know already. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, that's totally right. I mean, you can find throughout the centuries where somebody would say, man will never fly, man will never go to the moon, or whatever. And it's always kind of like the famous last word, that somebody got wrong, and then they're shown to just have got it wrong. And I think it's like that in today's world, that particularly with the internet and everything else, we think we know everything, and everywhere's fully explored. And, well, it's not. The oceans, the bottom of the oceans are still the bigger mysteries they were 50 years ago. A lot of the jungles of South America are barely, investigated or explored. The wilds of China and Russia, particularly, you've got vast wildernesses there that nobody ever goes to. So, I mean, lots of things could be going on in our world that we simply don't have any full awareness of. It is, you're right, I mean, just our arrogance and our assumption that we're the top dog, so to speak, and there's nothing better, and we know it all. And very often when you think you know it all, you come down with a crashing fall,
Another, I just thought of this while we were chatting, another interesting visualization, I guess you could say, of the Men in Black character would be, or observer type character. When you said Watcher before, you made me think. Yeah. Did you ever read comics when you were a kid?
No, not really, no.
Okay, Marvel Comics used to have a comic series called What If, and they had this character called Uatu, if I remember how to pronounce his name correctly, from 25, 30 years ago. And his name was the Watcher. And he was bald and had big white eyes. There was no pupils, just big white eyes, and he was totally bald, and he lived on the moon. And his race, they were all over the place, and they watched history and time unfold for, since its beginning. And they've been there they don't get involved, but they just keep an eye on things, and they report on things. I just thought of that.
No, that's interesting. Maybe whoever created the Watcher had a visit from the Men in Black.
Well, it's interesting how, when you think about it, it's this idea of this observer, watcher, whatever MIB type individual seems to be. It seems to permeate throughout history, and no matter what clothing they wear, the physical description of them seems to be the same. A very menacing type feeling, and they're bald. I noticed that every one of them is bald, and as we said earlier, they all have weird mannerisms. I'm going to cut us off right there because the break is sneaking up on us. Ladies and gentlemen, do not go anywhere. Go check out Nick's books. Final segment coming up. Another 25 minutes with my guest tonight. This is a hugely vast subject. Bigger than I thought. We'll be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back. Final segment. Interesting topic, the Men in Black. One of the most interesting topics I've come across in this paranormal phenomenon research community. Again, I didn't know anything about this stuff. I thought it was the the government agents coming to get you, and that whole deal. And researching this just for interviewing Nick and looking through his work on this subject, I was blown away. I was like, wow. So yeah, his research definitely has helped wake me up. It has helped introduce me to the fact that the Men in Black phenomenon is not just, again, government agents wearing black suits and fedoras running around scaring the crap out of people. So that being said, Nick, I know we only have a final segment here, about 25 minutes left. So I want to ask you, because if a few more things I want to ask you about the Men in Black. First, there's a story about a journalist, a writer, author named Marie Jones. And her story, her encounter with the Men in Black, is actually, I guess from a researcher standpoint, it's pretty creepy. So for the sake of the listening audience, go ahead and get into the story of Marie and what happened to her and who she is.
Well, sure. Well, Marie's a good friend of mine, and she's author of dozens of books on all sorts of different things. She's written all about synchronicities, psychic phenomena, the 2012 phenomenon, ancient mysteries, all sorts of different things she's focused on. And also, actually, she's written a book on time travel, so if you're ever interested in having somebody on the show, it's a brand new book. I think it came out about 18 months ago, a year ago, all about time travel, and it's a really good one. And but Marie, back in the 1990s, she was heavily involved in investigating the alien abduction phenomenon. In the 1980s, she was heavily involved in investigating the alien abduction phenomenon, and really was on the West Coast. And she, with a friend, they set up an alien abduction support group, not so much to investigate, every case of an abduction under the sun, so to speak, but to help people, where people could come along and talk about their experiences and share information, and hopefully, everybody would sort of get something out of it and sort of feel better and be able to cope with these events. And all was going well for a while, until Marie and her friend, both of them, got targeted by what we could sort of only describe as the Men in Black. Now, Marie's friend, she lived in a house, wasn't so much isolated, but it was sort of separated fairly significantly from other homes, and it was surrounded by like woodland and so on. And her friend told Marie how she'd seen these sort of shadowy figures on the fringes of the property, dressed like Men in Black, but they almost seemed to be walking around in like a stiff-legged, almost like a robotic fashion, as crazy as it sounds. And she got quite unnerved, as you probably would imagine. Now, Marie herself didn't get this, but what Marie got, she started to get these very weird phone calls, like literally 10, 11 o'clock at night, where it would be an unknown voice at the end of the phone. She described it as being sort of robotic and emotionless, as if it was almost literally just a totally emotion-free conversation, like the person or the whatever it was just didn't even understand how to talk to people properly. But it wasn't so much the tone that unnerved Marie, but whoever this voice was at the end of the phone would ask her questions, do you enjoy a particular book? And it was the one that she got on the bedside table. And this happened so many times that it was clear that whoever the caller was making it clear that they knew pretty much everything Marie was doing in her own house, even to the fact that she was lying in bed reading a specific book. And, of course, that freaked Marie out, probably even more than her friend was freaked out. And it really only began when they started doing this abduction work and support. And because they felt that it was intimately tied in with that, they basically both decided to get out of it. And they were like, enough's enough. They both felt they'd been sort of significantly traumatized, and that if they didn't leave it alone, they were going to become the subject of even more, threats, and maybe even direct threats, who knows. And so they closed down this particular support group and walked away from it. And as I said, although Marie still does a lot of paranormal research and writing today, obviously, that particular aspect, she's left it alone. And interestingly enough, the Men in Black have left her alone as well. But it certainly was, Marie's actually a very strong character, but even she said, it totally scared the whatever out of her, and she just could not deal with it anymore, just the stress of who's watching me and where are they and that kind of thing. And it kind of demonstrates the sort of extent to which people do become frightened, become paranoid, and don't know how to cope with this. And really the only successful way that works is when they walk away from whatever's causing the MIB to bother them. And it's not like after the person's left the subject behind, the MIB just screw with them for the sake of it. No, that they go. It's like when the job's done, they're out of there and on to the next person.
And, mission accomplished if they knocked her off track and she's too frightened to look into this. And this seems to be an occurrence, not a rare occurrence, I should say, amongst MIB investigators and even some ufologists. But people that look into the MIB themselves have had their own weird experiences where, they show up or they get threatened and whatnot. Have you ever had any weird experiences yourself looking into this? Because, you've written 2 books. You're on your 3rd. I would expect you, out of anybody, to have somebody phase themselves into your living room.
Well, that's not happened. But the one thing that actually has happened, and this gets really kind of weird, is that when the book I wrote, The Real Men in Black, came out in 2011, I was doing a lot of radio for it. I've written a lot of books over the years on various aspects of UFOs and Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster, you name it. But it was only when I was doing the radio for this particular book that I ended up having just countless examples of very weird telephone interference whenever I would do an interview on the Men in Black book. And that occurred, for example, on well-known shows like Whitley Strieber's Unknown Country and Coast to Coast, to where we had to hang up or re-record parts of the interview, or, the line would drop, and then the cell phone wouldn't work. That was very weird when I did Coast to Coast. The landline dropped, and my cell phone drained almost immediately, which is very, very strange. And telephone interference is something that is almost sort of unanimously reported in Men in Black encounters. Sometimes even after the Men in Black have gone, like a day or two later, the phone will ring at 2 in the morning and the person will pick it up and it'll just be weird static, or almost sometimes what sounds like a foreign language or just a totally incomprehensible language, just rapidly chattering down the line. And don't know, I haven't had that aspect, or at least not yet, but a lot of weird phone interference when I was promoting the book, to where it became obvious that, to me at least, something was going on. And so that's kind of the closest I've had to it. But, that was enough to make it memorable, at least.
And to back up his statement right before we went on air, because you all couldn't hear this because I had us disconnected from the live stream at the time. But and Nick can attest to this, I actually muted us up really quick and said to him, if you get disconnected, because I know that there's a history of this, just call the number I gave you back and I'll bring you back in through the system. And he was like, okay. So this is what he's been through. Like, I can, for me to tell him that as a host to a guest, I knew that there was actually a history of this every time he talked about this. And I actually heard the Coast to Coast interview where you kept getting disconnected and you kept having phone issues. So, oh wow, it's just when weird things happen like that, it makes you go, You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, it does. And for me, I think it's done for intimidation. Whoever these MIB are, they do it for intimidation. And for me, it kind of pushes me on to investigate the Man in Black mystery further. It doesn't intimidate me away from it, because that's so not my character. It pushes me on to investigate it more. But, there are people like Marie, I said very strong character, but even she kind of buckled and was like, no, I've just got to leave this alone. So, unfortunately, from the perspective of the witness, the Men in Black usually do come across, and even I hate to admit this, but the Men in Black do usually come across as the winners in these situations. They do end up silencing the witness. They do scare the witness to death, and the witness does walk away from it all and is like, no, enough's enough. So they're whatever their job is, whoever they are, they're very good at it.
Have you ever seen an instance in your research where the MIB caused the death of somebody because they wouldn't listen?
Well, not directly. I mean, there are a few cases where it's sort of been claimed that there may have been a connection, but, you know, it's not really tangible, and time-wise, you know, the death might have occurred a year or 18 months after in a car accident or something, and the person has sort of made a connection. Well, these guys threatened me, and then, you know, this person or family member got killed in a car accident, but that's the closest. But then, of course, you know, people would often sort of question, well, was there a connection, or is it somebody had bad luck in their lives 2 years later and they made a connection? You know, it's always difficult to say. But that's the interesting thing about the Men in Black, is that they make the threat, and the threat itself is very often enough to where that there's actually not like a follow-through, you know. It kind of stays at that level, but that is enough to silence the witness anyway.
Maybe the level of menace and fear that they exude, and that the person feels when they deal with them, perhaps, maybe, you know, that has something to do with it, because there's always that report of menace and stuff. We only got about 13 minutes left, so I want to segue to the last question, because again, there's never enough time. Ladies and gentlemen, you have to go read his books on the subject, because again, I was actually quite astonished at the amount of sightings and, you know, people bumping into this. Again, everybody from ufologists to Bigfoot researchers to MIB researchers themselves to the people that research the occult or were practicing the occult. Just a lot broader variety of instances than one would think, and that's why I like to call Nick the crossover king. He is one of the few researchers out there that has the balls big enough to actually sit down and have a discussion about this openly and say, yes, there is connections between a bunch of these different things. And although people might not want to admit it, because that might make them sound crazy, he has the courage to talk about it. And again, kudos to him. So there's an interesting connection that I want to bring up here. Final, piece here, final question, or final piece of the puzzle I want to throw out there. The Mothman. How do the MIB connect to the Mothman?
Well, the Mothman, I'm sure most of your listeners will have heard the movie The Mothman Prophecies, which was actually based on a book by John Keel of the same name, The Mothman Prophecies. And it's basically a true story. Goes back to a town called Point Pleasant in West Virginia in the mid-'60s, where the town itself, never mind just one person, the town itself was sort of targeted almost, or hit, by a wide range of paranormal phenomena. UFO encounters, ghostly activity, psychic phenomena, premonitions, all sorts of things. And at the height of it all, there were sightings of this weird creature that became known as Mothman. Now, the name Mothman kind of sounds, you know, you brought up comic books, so it kind of sounds like a superhero type name, like Spider-Man or something, you know. But Mothman was actually more of like a very sinister, almost shadowy wraith-type creature, like a winged gargoyle type creature almost, with glowing eyes. Kind of like a shadowier version of the creature out of Jeepers Creepers, the Jeepers Creepers movie, sort of like that. And it all sort of culminated in the collapse of the town's Silver Bridge, which collapsed into the Ohio River in December '67, killing more than 40 people who drowned when their cars fell into the river and they couldn't get out the cars. And a lot of people in town, and also researchers like Keel, came to believe that the presence of Mothman was somehow connected with this disaster. Now, some researchers feel that Mothman was the cause of this event. Other people feel that Mothman is kind of like a guardian or a warning entity that surfaces around the world on different times when a disaster is about to happen. And its manifestation is designed to alert people and warn them rather than being the cause of it. Now, regardless of what the truth is, the fact is that all these different phenomena like UFO encounters, paranormal stuff, premonitions, the collapse of the bridge, the Mothman sightings, all occurred around about late 65 through late 67. But at the height of it all, people all around town were getting visits from the Men in Black. And again, they were these sort of little guys, 5 foot to 5'5" tall, white skin, again, not really understanding our ways properly, making sort of very kind of shadowy comments and threats that could be interpreted in different ways, but the witnesses always found them unsettling. There's a famous story of a woman named Mary Hire, who was a journalist in the area who covered a lot of the Mothman stories, and she talked about how she actually got visits at her office late at night when she was working late at night from these sort of creepy MIB. One of them said to her, what would you do if somebody told you to stop writing about flying saucers? And she said, I'd tell them to go to hell, which kind of sort of put something in the works there and stopped them, on that occasion. But then on another time, this very weird story, one of these little creepy MIB was talking to Mary Hire and, making sort of veiled threats and so on. But he couldn't take his eyes off her ballpoint pen, which was on her office desk. And he suddenly grabbed it and made this sort of weird, almost like chillingly strange, weird cackling laugh and ran out into the darkness of the night. Now, as crazy as that sounds, throughout history, you can find reports of paranormal entities, everything from demons to goblins and all sorts of things, that it was almost like their duty, that when they manifest into our reality, it was almost like their duty to take like a souvenir back with them or steal it. And that was kind of ties in with Mary Hire's Man in Black, that he was sort of entranced by this pen and stole it and just charged out the door. So there's a lot of cases like that in relation to Mothman and the Men in Black in Point Pleasant that are not just weird, they're just totally off the wall, and there's really no way to describe them. But again, the fact that Point Pleasant wasn't home to the Men in Black before all this other stuff kicked off, is suggestive of some sort of direct connection, even if we're not really sure of what the connection might be. So there's, something is going on with Mothman that links it to the Men in Black in some capacity.
What do you think Mothman is? Looking into because I know you've looked into cryptids and stuff. So, like, aside from the Men in Black part of it, what do you think Mothman is?
Well, I don't think, as some researchers do, that Mothman is like a literal large-winged animal. I think it is more of like a paranormal creature. And there are indications, because they've been seen elsewhere, that they are tied in with disaster and tragedy and things like that. But I kind of go with the idea that Keel suggested, and also a friend of mine, Andy Colvin, who's written a number of books in more recent years on Mothman, that he takes the view, and I do, that Mothman, I think, is some sort of warning entity, and possibly it's something that is able to manifest almost out of if you have an area that's got negative energy and something's looming on the theory is if a disaster's looming, that in some way it can be almost like forecasted and the negative energy is already in the air, and the Mothman could be sort of a warning entity that is alerted to when there are these sort of spikes of negative energy and something's about to happen, and in its own strange but detached way, it presents itself as a way to try and warn people of something that's about to happen to them. And so I don't kind of view it as the villain of the piece, so to speak, even though it kind of looks, horrifying. I think it is more of sort of a guardian type creature, but not sort of a literal animal. I think it is something sort of definitively supernatural, regardless of how we actually define what the world of the supernatural is.
In your research into it, how far back do the stories about Mothman go? Like, is it more recent times, or do they actually go back into even times of, maybe of Native American times?
Well, yeah, I mean, the important thing to remember is Mothman is just a term for what is essentially a large-winged unknown creature with sort of supernatural overtones. But you can find throughout history, going back thousands of years, reports of very similar creatures. For example, in England, there's a creature known as Owlman, which, as you can guess from its name, it's like a large, more like feathery humanoid creature with glowing red eyes, seen in one particular area of the southwest of England. There was a creature very similar to Mothman, seen in the city of Houston late one night in 1953, which became known as the Houston Batman, and which was actually mentioned quite prominently in the local Houston daily newspaper at the time. And that was described like Mothman, sort of humanoid, glowing eyes, bat-like wings. You can go back to sort of earlier times when you had things like gargoyles and harpies. They all sound very much similar to Mothman and different ones today. There's a famous case from the Vietnam War in 1969 when 3 military personnel saw this strange humanoid, almost oily black figure, and it was like a naked woman, and they swore. They actually prepared an official report saying they saw this woman with these large, almost like pterodactyl-type wings and just gliding over the North Vietnamese jungles, and they just sort of stared open-mouthed. And so a lot of these reports all throughout history and all around the world of things that are like Mothman, but certainly Mothman has become the most well-known of them all.
So there are actually more of them, and in my research I've seen the same thing, but that's why I wanted to ask you if you agreed or not that it was more than just this phenomenon of Mothman, but there were connections to other sightings of other things that looked like Mothman.
Yeah, I think what's happened is because John Keel's book was such a big hit and then it was made into a movie, when anybody thinks of like winged humanoid creatures, they think of Mothman because that's the most visible one and the most well-known one. It's kind of like when people talk about crashed UFO stories, everybody thinks of Roswell, not realizing there are actually a lot of similar stories to Roswell, just less well-known. But again, for me, when you've got tie-ins with Mothman and the Men in Black, that suggests a link somewhere. And also, for example, a friend of mine in England, John Downes. John's probably the one person, I say probably, he is the one person more than anybody else who's written about the Owlman mystery, which is like Britain's Mothman. And John wrote sort of a defining book on this called The Owlman and Others. And at the height of John's research, he started to experience a lot of almost like bad luck and weird things going on in his life where, it's like every day was his worst Monday morning. And it was kind of like only when he backed away from it did it stop. And, John wasn't sure if it was because he was getting too close to something and it was warning him off, or the stuff was happening to him, he was just having to run a bad luck and the creature manifested because he was having bad luck rather than being the cause again. But John also had various instances of weird telephone stuff and people he was in touch with having weird telephone interference as well. And John actually walked away from, like Albert Bender with the Men in Black. John won't touch the Owlman stuff anymore. He says, every time I get into it, something bad happens. And, and as an author and a researcher, it intimidated him, and he won't do anything with it anymore. But he's written a defining book on it, as I said, The Owlman and Others. So in that sense, he felt he could walk away with it because his work was done anyway.
It's interesting how researchers that research a lot of this ominous, the more ominous things like the Mothman or Owlman, MIB, seem to get warnings from these ominous beings, figures, whatever, or bad things happen to them. And you were even mentioned. You had mentioned the occult earlier, how, playing with that or researching that and looking too hardcore into that can get people sick. Interesting side note, the TV show Paranormal State that used to be on A&E, the lead kid in that show, Ryan, he's a very young kid. He's now only 30 years old. He's suffering pancreatic cancer. And if you remember, they used to go charge into supposedly haunted areas or places with demons, and used to take on this evil energy. And now this kid's only 30 years old with pancreatic cancer. So it just made me think of that when you said that it can cause physical illness.
Well, I mean, Albert Bender's a perfect example. If you read his book and Barker's book, Bender had all these pulverizing headaches, stomach problems, psychological issues, and it all was born out of these experiences. And that's why I say to people, don't go into it lightly. But what I always also tell people is it's important to have a regular life as well. And sometimes people get pulled into this so deeply and darkly that it's as if the phenomenon literally gets its grips into them and won't let go, and it takes over their lives. That's why I always say, people say, how do you stay sane? Well, it's because I balance what I do in the day. I when I'm writing and researching, I stick strictly, unless I'm doing like a radio show tonight, I strictly stick to working 8 to 5, Monday to Friday. Then at night, I'll watch the English football games, go down the pub, hang out with friends, whatever, and just do normal stuff. Most of my friends aren't into all this sort of stuff, so it's a totally different life. But there are occasions when I really do believe that there are like occult or supernatural creatures, is probably the best way to term them, that are almost like parasitic. They feed on us, and the more they get the hooks into you, the less easy it is to let go, and they bleed you dry of whatever it is they want, and they manipulate you and they use you, maybe just for the fun of it, maybe they're just downright evil. And that's why I always say to people, if you want to investigate it, fine, but read into it first about the potential hazards and the spin-off negative effects that can possibly affect you as well.
I agree. Nick, I have to cut us off there because we are out of time. Thank you so much for coming on again, brother.
Sure, not a problem. Enjoyed it and covered a lot of areas. So.
Yes, sir. As always, an informative show. Ladies and gentlemen, check out his books. Make sure you get a U-Haul if you purchase all of them, because there is a ton of them. Anyway, I'll catch you all again tomorrow night. Love you all. Research, research, research. Educate yourselves. We're out of here.
Feeling a bit like Alice, tumbling down the rabbit hole? Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life. That there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence. On infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of election, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. But I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people.
And now, welcome to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole. Here's your host from federaljack.com. It's Popeye.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another live edition. It is Tuesday, November 12th, 2013. I have a extremely interesting broadcast for you all tonight. I'm excited to bring back to the airwaves a guest I had on a few weeks ago. I was able to first introduce you. And we did a bit of a nutshell kind of overview on a broad variety of topics: UFOs, cryptids like Bigfoot, aliens, things like that. And he is such a wealth of information and an excellent researcher and a great author, I may add, that one show with him covering a few of these topics, for 20 minutes each, was not enough. So I'm going to devote as much time as I can to having him on, about specific topics, and spend more time into each of these topics every few weeks, whenever he has the time to do so, because he does a lot of radio interviews, and he's, gracious enough to give up his 2 hours tonight to sit with us. So Author Nick Redfern. If you haven't heard the interview I did with him about 2 weeks ago, go listen to it. Great interview. Again, we kind of covered a lot of these topics that maybe aren't normally.
And a lot of people thought, well, it was just like a gimmick, to try and get publicity, and then he was going to come back. But he actually didn't. He stayed out the subject for 10 years. And then again, and after that 10 years, he only came back very briefly to write his own book on what he said happened. But the short story is that he was visited by 3 men in black, who, like you said, scared the living daylights out of him and essentially made him leave ufology, or suggested it would be a good idea to. But the problem was, Bender was a bit of a reclusive and quiet character. Of all things, he lived in the attic of an old house that looked straight out of the house that Norman Bates would live in Psycho. And on top of that, he lived in the attic of this house. And he was going to actually change it into like a chamber of horrors type place and charge people to sort of wander around in this spooky old house. So, he did a lot of weird stuff. But because he was quite reclusive, he only sort of alluded to being silenced by the Men in Black. And a number of his colleagues and friends, one named Gray Barker, wrote a book about Bender's experiences in 1956 called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. And it tells the story of the visit from the Men in Black. But because Bender had been so reclusive and quiet on it, Barker assumed that Bender's experiences were with, like, the Men in Black that you've seen in the movies with Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith, sort of government people, not realizing that that's actually the exact opposite of what Bender was speaking about. And through no fault of Barker's, it was just because Bender wouldn't elaborate on it. So that kind of, Barker's book gave birth to the motif or the idea that the Men in Black are from the government. But it was only when Bender set the record straight later on and other reports began to surface that it became clear that it was sort of much stranger than that.
Yeah, and see, that's where my understanding of the Men in Black was. And it wasn't from the movie, the Tommy Lee Jones movie. I had heard about the Men in Black when I looked into UFOs when I was much younger, because that's where I had been exposed to them, was the UFO thing. So I had always just, gotten with or I'd only been exposed to, rather, the story of them, government agents wearing the suits and the fedoras, and they always show up in these old cars, from the 50s. And that's all I knew. And I figured maybe it was a gimmick with it was some sort of gimmick, the way they dressed as a way to, kind of intimidate or whatever. And maybe, it still worked today because the suit would still be acceptable to walk around in. So it wouldn't look, you'd look a little out of place, but not too much so that you'd be like a spaceman walking around in a spacesuit in the middle of, lower Manhattan. It wouldn't be like that. So I always bought into that, but this Bender story in and of itself, the real story, not the version, the misconception of it, but the real story, it's much darker than that. It almost has occult leanings to it.
Oh, it does. I mean, when Barker, as I said, Barker left the UFO subject in 52, and people thought, well, he's going to be back in 3 or 4 months, and it'll be a good boost for his ratings and his magazine sales. But actually it didn't happen. He walked away, and he just came back very briefly in 1962, because Gray Barker had been pestering him for years to write his own book on what really happened. And so Bender finally did that, and Barker was also a publisher as well as an author, so Barker published Bender's story. And Bender's book was called The Flying Saucers and the Three Men. And he told the story in Bender's own words of what really happened to him, which, as I said, was nothing to do with the government. And the basic story, if we go back to when Bender's magazine and his research was at its height from sort of 50 to 52, he used to, as I said, he's a very solitary character. Saturday nights, he just used to go to the cinema or whatever, and then go home. That was his sort of social life. And on a number of occasions, specifically after he'd started his UFO research, when he was walking home from the cinema through the sort of dark old streets of Bridgeport, he started to see these. The only way you can describe it is like shadowy, almost silhouetted figures, kind of in the shadows of the doorways and alleyways and things like that. And they seem to have these weirdly glowing eyes. And he said even on a couple of occasions he kind of saw them sort of literally manifest in the dark corners of the cinema, but no one else could see them apart from him, and they seemed to be sort of staring intently at him with these weird-looking eyes. And then on several occasions when he was back at home, he would go to bed, or he'd go to his room, I should say, and on several occasions he'd start to feel dizzy and lightheaded and faint, and he'd be sort of overcome by this smell of like brimstone or sulfur, which is like a classic example of what happens in a lot of paranormal cases, you know, sort of in olden times, the smell of brimstone was associated with the devil. And Bender said that he would be sort of sent nausea, into like a state of nausea by this kind of brimstone smell, and he would feel lightheaded and he would lay down. And then suddenly these three shadowy MIB-like figures would sort of literally sort of materialise through the wall and the doors and stand in front of him in kind of like a semi-spectral state, but they seem to be like ghostly, but they're dressed in a black suit and an old-time black fedora. And they were described as very, very skinny, almost like emaciated skinny. Skin, you know, the colour of somebody's face who's got severe anemia, just sort of, you know, as white as milk. And they had this sort of menacing, starey look on the face where you could actually see through the glasses. You know, you could see make a vague outline of the eyes, and they were kind of staring at him malevolently and warned him on a number of occasions to leave the UFO subject behind. And the Bender didn't, and the more he stayed with it, the sicker he got. He got sort of psychologically disturbed, but also physically ill. And again, that's something that happens in a lot of occult cases where people fall ill. They get diseases or illnesses and things like this. And so he kind of eventually got the message and dropped the subject and got married and left the whole subject behind. And this is sort of 53, 54, the very latest, when he dropped it all, and just went on to a new life. And the Men in Black after that never bothered him again, apparently. So their intimidation worked, and, you know, as I said, he walked away from it and went back to sort of just a regular life. But it so kind of unbalanced him that, as I said, he stayed away for 10 years. And after he'd written the book, he just did, you know, a couple of months promotion for it. And that was it again. You know, 51 years later, he's you know, he never surfaced again after that time. So it clearly intimidated him, and it clearly wasn't a gimmick, you know, to sort of promote himself and make himself look intriguing and sell books. He was done with it, you know.
And the Men in Black experience itself, the typical, it's hard to, from what I've seen, there's a few different types of Men in Black. So I guess you really can't say it's a typical Men in Black experience, but is there a common thread to these Men in Black experiences? Is there something that is common to all of them? Because I know, like I said, there are a few different types, apparently, of Men in Black, and I want to get into that too, but is there a common thread at all amongst them?
Well, there is. I mean, that actually is a good point. You know, we can sort of get into that quite deeply, because it is an important thing, the different categories of the MIB. But in terms of the weird MIB, there are several classic things that sort of bring them all together. One is that in many cases, the witnesses have never actually reported their encounter. So this is the big baffling thing, how the MIB actually know they've had some sort of weird experience. Now, you might imagine that, you know, if you've seen a UFO, you had a paranormal experience, and the Men in Black come knocking on the door late at night, as they often do, sort of 10, 11, or even midnight, that, you know, if they're ominous, they're going to threaten you. You might imagine that they're going to knock the door down or, you know, force their way in, but they don't. They actually sort of stand patient. They knock on the door, and then if the person opens the door, they just stand there patiently waiting to be invited in, which is kind of very much like the old vampire legends of a vampire, you know, can't enter your home until you're invited in on the first occasion. And they kind of look like vampires. You know, they're dressed in black and they got white skin. You know, it's like, how much closer could they get? So that's one of the interesting angles. They seem to have a lot of prior and very personal knowledge of the encounter, even, as I said, if the person hasn't reported it or even told anybody else. It's as if they were almost monitoring the event when it occurred. And very often, or usually, they never make sort of outright threats. They make kind of almost like oblique threats, where you think, hey, was that guy just threatening me? That sort of thing, where it could go sort of two ways in terms of what they're trying to say, but the implication is it's a threat, So a lot of things like that. Very often they come in twos or threes, and just one does the talking, and the other one just kind of stares in a very intimidating, threatening fashion. One of the witnesses actually described the eyes of the man in black who just sat there staring at her, kind of like the eyes of a dog when it's about to bite you. If you loom over a dog and it gets scared, and its eyes go wide, it was kind of like that. So those are all sort of classic aspects, and one of the other ones is that, if the person isn't sure who they are, they offer them a drink or something like that, they usually refuse it. Or if they do accept it, they're almost puzzled by it as what they should actually do with it, which has sort of given rise to the idea, are they even sort of fully self-aware, or are they some sort of biological robot, or some sort of, almost like a three-dimensional computer program that, they're just dispatched to do a job, and if you kind of throw it off, you sort of put a glitch in the program or whatever.
Have you ever seen a show on Fox called Fringe? It's
well, a lot of people don't know that, but the watchers in Fringe were actually based on the Men in Black reports. They actually use one famous example where a man in black was sitting in a restaurant and he couldn't eat the food properly. He didn't know how to eat Jell-O. He tried to drink it, and they had actually did something like that in one of the early episodes where they had one of the watchers in a restaurant and he couldn't figure out how to eat the food properly.
Yeah, they eat weird. They have they have mannerisms that are odd. That's why that made me think of that when I first saw that. I was like, oh wow, they remind me of the Observers.
Well, the Observers, I said, not watchers, but the Observers, they're actually taken directly from, that whole weirder Men in Black imagery. They're the other side to Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones, if you like.
And it makes you wonder, because in the show they're a future human, they're like some future race, or future version of the human race, thousands of years ahead or whatever, and they figured out how to travel back in time and or how to master time, whatever.
That is one of the theories for them, as to who they are. That is one of the ideas is, could they be time travelers?
I'm telling you, this subject, when I saw Fringe, I saw the guys, the Observers, and I was like, yeah, they look like the MIBs, because the fedora and the suit and everything. And I was like, they look like government agents. And I was like, oh, this is an interesting twist. But then when I started researching the real stories of, real MIB experiences, I was like, wow, they ripped off, covered by many in the alternative media. It might be considered the fringe end of it, right? UFOs, stuff like that, Bigfoot, Loch Ness, other cryptids. But this stuff is interesting. Again, this is the stuff that brought me to conspiracy and everything else when I was a young lad. And I don't see any reason why we shouldn't look into things. And sometimes with constantly harping on how bad, Obamacare is, or how bad politics are, or the powers that shouldn't be, it's nice to have a bit of a distraction and look at some other weirdness, which is out there as well. Sometimes we get a little bit myopic with our views. Anyway, I don't want to waste any more time. I want to bring him up tonight. Tonight we're going to be discussing the real Men in Black. And no, it's nothing like the movie with Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith. And I know Nick's going to get into that, but let me bring him up to the airwaves for you all to hear. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the broadcast, author Nick Redfern. Nick, welcome back, brother.
Hey, Popeye. How's it going?
It's going real good.
Good.
This the topic of the Men in Black. I was talking with you about this off air a little bit. This is I admittedly did not know much about this topic, and you had you had told me a little bit about it. We had chatted off air. You had thrown a couple tidbits here and said, "Hey, you should check this out." And in preparation for tonight's broadcast, I was like, "Let me go look into some of these Men in Black stories." I didn't want to just go listen to interviews that you've done. And kind of reiterate the same things. I wanted to go actually look into some of the stories themselves, as well as, I listened to a few of the interviews you've done, but I wanted to actually go dive into some of these stories. And, man, it's creepy. I mean, this isn't just, there's, to me, I always thought the Men in Black were, government agents. They came up with their, fedoras and their suits on, and they came up, they busted your chops, scared you, put the fear of God into the whoever, and then left. And it's not that. This is actually a much, much deeper topic. So let's start off with the beginning. The Men in Black phenomenon, as it's called, it dates back to the 50s, correct? After World War II is when this phenomenon started, with the Men in Black and the suits with the fedoras?
Yeah, I mean, the whole sort of so-called modern era, the UFO subject, sort of took off in 47 with the pilot named Kenneth Arnold, who had a sighting of like a fleet of UFOs over Mount Rainier in Washington State. But the weird thing is that although Arnold's sighting was 47, the Men in Black phenomenon really didn't begin until about 51, 52. Although there were a few sporadic reports like that, it wasn't sort of developed into a phenomenon at that time. But what happened, it all began in a town called Bridgeport, Connecticut, involving a man named Albert Bender. And Albert Bender was someone who was, when the whole UFO subject kicked off in 47, he was sort of in his mid to late 20s then. So turn of the early 50s, he was around about 30, thereabouts. And he had a deep interest in UFOs, but also the world of the paranormal in both fact and fiction. He was heavily into sort of the occult, life after death, ghosts, but also horror fiction, like H.P. Lovecraft and movies and things like that. And he set up a UFO group called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. And for whatever reason, we're not really sure why, but unlike a lot of other groups that were set up at the time, this one really caught the public's imagination. And in no time at all, Bender was selling like in excess of 1,000 copies of his monthly journal every month. And this wasn't just in the US, it was Australia, Britain, different parts of Europe, all over the place. And he really developed this huge network of followers. And then, quite literally out of the blue, and only about 5 or 6 months after the magazine had been going, he shut it down, and he also shut down the International Flying Saucer Bureau.